Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. Today, we are bringing you a live episode of Our Curious Amalgam. The topic, should antitrust be used as an anti-inflation tool? Taking the yes position is Hal Singer, Managing Director of Econ 1 Research and Adjunct Professor at Georgetown School of Business. Taking the no position is Joshua Wright, Executive Director of the Global Antitrust Institute and Professor at Scalia Law School. Without further ado, here's Anora, Wang and Jana Seidl, live from George Mason University Law School in Arlington, Virginia.
Wow, that just feels wonderful. Jana, how do you feel coming back to law school that we both attended?
You know, it's exciting. It's really the place that sparked the antitrust bug in me. So to be able to have our first live Our Curious Amalgam debate podcast, it's really special to me. And it's great to see so many students in the audience today that are here to hear from our two guests about a really current and hot antitrust topic.
That's great. So on the topic, can you tell us a little bit why there is even a debate?
Sure. So the U.S. economy is currently experiencing inflation, as we all know, with a consumer price index that actually climbed by 7% in 2021. And to put that in context, that's the largest 12-month gain since June of 1982. Of course, price doesn't increase at the same rate for different sectors of the economy, but many have argued that concentration and a lack of antitrust enforcement is to blame here, and especially when it comes to industries that involve household staples. So some have proposed specifically to use antitrust as a tool to combat inflation. Not all agree that that's a sensible approach, and so we're here to debate that today.
That's great. And we've actually done a quick pre-debate poll from the students here. Could you give us the numbers?
Sure. We're actually almost evenly split, with a bit of more in favor of using antitrust as an anti-inflation tool. So 52.2% of the students here today, or those voting in the audience listening, think that antitrust should be used as an anti-inflation tool.
That's a great basis to work with. So do you have a personal prediction, given what you knowledge of the preparation, that you think the debate is going to go?
Oh, that's a tough one. So we have two very dynamic and persuasive guests here. So they'll be arguing either side of the issue. I think that there will be equally offsetting changes in both directions, but we'll see.
Okay, let's bring our guests out, speakers out. Hello, Hal and Josh.
Hey there. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So now let's get to our pre-agreed upon protocol. We're going to give Hal 4 minutes for his initial arguments. Are you ready? You can go now.
Well, thanks to GAA for having me, and I relish the opportunity to go up against antitrust skeptics like my good friend Josh here. I also want to thank the sponsor, Chick-fil-A, for feeding hungry law school students and for participating as an antitrust plaintiff in a lawsuit against chicken suppliers, alleging that bid rigging caused Chick-fil-A to overpay for their chicken, which you're eating today. So the sponsor is likely in my corner and gets 10 votes. Now, turning to the debate question, my answer is yes. Antitrust should be used as one tool among many to combat inflation. And this position shouldn't be controversial. Antitrust is about controlling the unlawful exercise of market power, which is defined as raising prices above competitive levels and thus generating short-term inflation. Now, raising interest rates is an effective tool at combating inflation, but by cutting demand, that tool imposes a large economic toll. Aggregate demand is not up by enough to explain this bout of inflation. Instead, COVID caused the demand to shift from services back to physical things, which strains our supply, leading to price hikes as a rationing tool. Now, because the source of inflation is coming from the supply side, government should focus their energies there. One supply-side approach is to alleviate capacity constraints. Another is to increase competition. Now, alleviating capacity constraints caused by a pandemic falls outside of the economic toolkit. That's a job for medical experts and to make vaccines. And so that leaves antitrust as the remaining supply-side economic tool. Now, the price of beef and poultry increased by over 20% since December 2019. Because beef and poultry are included in the basket of goods that comprise the CPI, a direct causal nexus exists between higher beef and poultry prices and broader inflation. Now, antitrust skeptics insist that concentration can't be behind this recent bout of inflation because they say there hasn't been any change in concentration the last 2 years. Yet, no change in concentration is needed to explain why beef and poultry prices are skyrocketing. These industries are highly concentrated, and economics teaches us that concentrated industries are susceptible to price coordination. The pandemic provides the perfect cover for coordinated pricing, and indeed, general inflation can serve as a pretext for a coordinated price hike. But don't take my word for it, Josh. Antitrust luminaries like Steve Salop and Fiona Scott Morton wrote that if scale economies lead to mergers, the risk of disruption from an epidemic will, and I quote you, lead to a larger price impact than if there were more diversity in the industry, end quote. Former DOJ economist and current Georgetown professor Nathan Miller explained that antitrust, by decreasing the slope of the supply curve, that is, flattening the supply curve, could reduce upward pricing pressure. Now, here's what I'm calling for. Automatic antitrust probes into industries that meet three criteria: high concentration, rising margins, and year-over-year price hikes in excess of 10%. Meatpacking meets all three conditions, with skyrocketing prices and margins. Clearly, these firms are not just passing along their costs. The point is to put concentrated industries on notice and thereby discourage explicit or tacit collusion. Now, economists assess policies from a cost-benefit perspective. In terms of the benefits, automatic antitrust probes, when the three criteria are met, would make cartels think twice about jointly raising prices. Indeed, we've already seen some success from this policy. Beef prices rose every month from December 2020 until December 2021, when they suddenly reversed and fell by 2.5%, right as President Biden was starting to put on the heat. Now, in terms of the cost of my proposal, last sentence, I promise I ask you, what is the harm of using antitrust to discourage price hikes in concentrated industries? I'll leave it at that.
Great. First, I would like to thank Hal for naming every antitrust nerd on Twitter. If you're interested, you can go follow them up, and their debates would continue there. So can we clarify a little bit? So is your position simply that for many industries or sectors, it's simply already too concentrated, and that's why antitrust is the fix?
I think that's a good way of putting it. Not every industry, but many industries are concentrated. And when we see concentration and we see price hikes and we see margins increasing, right, that tells us that they're not just passing along their costs. And so where there's smoke, there's potentially fire. And what I'm suggesting is that there ought to be an automatic trigger, that the agencies ought to focus their resources here and put these cartels on notice. You know, when there's so much disruption going on during a pandemic, you have supply disruptions and chaos. This is a great time, great cover to use, right? And all the disarray. And given that Josh acknowledges it's we don't detect all the cartels that are going on in the country, this is a great time to exploit it and to raise prices. And so I think we ought to be going after them. This is where our resources ought to be focused.
Can we clarify your position a little bit? You're not saying antitrust is the best or only fix for the current, quote-unquote, bout of inflation, right? It's one of the tools that you think would fix some long-term problem.
I think it is the best tool that we have in the economic toolkit for this bout of inflation. And the reason why is, look, if you could convince me that what we've seen is a shift in the aggregate demand outward, caused, for example, by either the Trump or the Biden stimulus, then I would say, by all means, let's attack the demand side of the economy. But what the economists are saying, at least the economists I'm reading are saying, is that we haven't seen enough of a shift in the demand to justify this much inflation. What they instead are saying is the composition of demand has changed from services. Remember, we used to go on cruise ships and stuff, to physical things. Everyone is going out and, getting houses and putting in physical things in the back of their houses, Josh. You know what I'm talking about? Pools and stuff. And so this is why, if the problem is on the supply side, right, then we ought to focus our energies on the supply side.
Mm-hmm. Just so that we could have something to actually debate on, would you concede there is any valid concern for using antitrust as an an anti-inflation tool?
No, I'm not going to concede there's a valid concern. I can come up with some purported costs. I mean, one thing that I want to put to Josh he can either do it in his intro or whenever, is I want him to tell me what is the harm of the policy that I'm proposing, right? And I don't want to speculate until I hear what he has to say. I could try to guess where he's going, but why don't we give Josh a chance to say what he thinks the costs are?
That's fair. Whenever we have the clock ready, I think it's time to turn to Professor Wright.
All right. Thank you, Hal, and thank you for having us, and I'm especially glad to be doing this debate here at George Mason. I'm going to sort of make 2 points about why antitrust is a bad inflation tool and sort of confront Hal's theory in 2 different ways. It's wrong on the theory and the facts, but other than that, it's fine. So let's talk about the theory and then the facts. Start with what inflation is. Hal used the idea here. The theory is the pandemic gives a pretext, a cover, a cloud covering for firms to raise prices. I think the more general pretext in cloud cover that is happening here is there's no secret in our sort of viewpoints being different here. Hal would like a lot more antitrust cases than I would. And I think, if anything, the inflation is giving cover for more antitrust enforcement rather than anything else. But it doesn't have much to do with inflation. Here's why. Inflation is an increase in the general level of prices in the economy. There are kind of 2 stories you can tell about inflation, and Hal weaves back and forth between them a little bit, so the goalposts are moving a little bit for you, but stay with me. One of the stories is market power across the economy as a whole has caused an increase in prices. There are a bunch of problems with this story. The first is that market power is not generally up. That's a big problem. And if it is up, it's up in some industries and not others, but prices are going up everywhere. So, to give an example, in one of the very papers that Hal cites, they say the reason that markups are going up over time is because marginal costs are falling. Local market concentration, for those of you in the room who aren't antitrust people, sort of the number of competitors who are out there competing for your business in a bunch of markets, has gone down, not up over the time period. The problem for the general market power and inflation story is if there is market power, you need a reason why firms didn't raise prices yesterday. They just sort of didn't think of it. Or 2, you need to confront the evidence that you don't actually have an increase in market power across the economy, but prices are going up everywhere. Neither of those facts are consistent with the more general inflation and market power theory. To get around this, Hal tells a little bit of a more magical, specific theory. One you can't taste, see, touch, or smell, but he promises you is there. That story is that what's really going on is inflation gives covers for companies to collude. They didn't think about it before inflation, but with an inflation around, the antitrust enforcers won't get them. Right? So you can raise prices and nobody's looking because everybody's prices are going up. That's sort of the story. There's a problem with this one too. If you look at inflation data over time and you sort of look at how active antitrust enforcement has been over the past several decades, there's generally no correlation or relationship between antitrust enforcement activity and inflation. This is a fatal flaw in the theory. It sort of does away with it. But we'll go a step further. When you look at this sort of more general theory that the cloud cover of inflation lets firms collude, which, by the way, is a felony already, inflation or not, right? It's already unlawful. It begs the question, how are the bad guys getting caught when they collude? Are most investigations in the world because the DOJ, who does the criminal enforcement around collusion, sees a price increase and says, let's go investigate there? Or are they because of some other reason? They're mostly because of some other reason. Most of the time, it's an industry participant runs to the agency and says, don't sue me, we'll snitch on our industry partner, called cartel leniency. I get a get out of jail free card if I tell on my cartel member friend. Most of the investigations run that way, not independently through price increases. What's wrong with Hal's solution? Sort of what harm? More antitrust doesn't always lower prices. Sometimes it increases them. That's the exact opposite of Hal wants here. We all want good antitrust cases, but when actual proposals going on in the antitrust agencies right now are to do things like increase Robinson-Patman Act enforcement, to increase enforcement for low prices, not high prices, through predation, and to ban mergers with efficiencies that lower prices. That's the harm.
It's a great place to stop and have some clarification. So, Professor Wright, I'm still used to calling Professor Wright.
You don't have to call me professor anymore.
I feel a little timid that, I've been taking classes from Professor Wright for years now. Now, finally, I have a question to cold call him on this, so very happy. So, just to clarify, so your position is that antitrust would not work as a practical matter, is that right? It would actually, in fact, increase prices for many industries or sectors.
Two separate parts of the answer. Part one is there are some aspects of antitrust that are likely, and those proposed by this administration right now. Revival of the Robinson-Patman Act, and there are studies after study after study. The Robinson-Patman Act was never meant to lower prices. It was mostly meant to protect inefficient competitors, sort of mom-and-pop shops with higher costs. Plenty of things proposed by this administration right now with greater antitrust would result in higher prices. The second part of the answer is, Hal and I agree, you should bring good antitrust cases. But that's sort of boring, and it's not the debate question. The debate question is whether antitrust can be used systematically to address inflation. We both agree if there's collusion, the DOJ should go and find it and enforce and probably put some people in jail. I like a good antitrust case too. But that's a separate question from whether the agencies can, select out with omniscience the industries in which this is happening, or to pretend, as Hal does, that you can sort of ratchet up the antitrust enforcement to 11 and not have it result in any costs to the economy. In general, economists are really good at pointing out the cost of decisions. Hal's got a little bit of a blind spot on the cost of antitrust enforcement, but we're still buddies.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Robinson-Patman Act. So that's the example of a specific proposal to how to use antitrust as a tool to potentially fix the inflation problem. Are there any proposals out there that you would, I wouldn't use the word concede, but potentially entertain and see the value of antitrust and potentially help bring down the prices a little bit?
Antitrust is a market-by-market, industry-by-industry tool. It is very much true that a good antitrust case that attacks anti-competitive price increases can reduce prices. That's always true. It's true when there's inflation. It's true when there's not inflation. It's true on a plane, on a train, right? It's true all the time. It just doesn't have anything to do with inflation. And that's the bill of goods that's being sold, is that we can get our policy goals. More inflation, Hal would like that. He gave you a list of Steve Salop and famous people who really like all the antitrust, right? Famous in our world anyway, right? Who really like all of the antitrust. And the idea is, hey, let's use inflation. Don't let a crisis go to waste. Let's use inflation to get a bunch more antitrust. There are cases that are good antitrust cases to bring. None of them are going to solve inflation. Some of them would make the world a better place.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'd like to take a step back. When you started your initial argument, you said, let's look at the theory and facts. Let's now turn to the facts a little bit. I think Hal pointed to the beef industry as an example, that there is actual success in using antitrust or even signaling the use or enforcement of antitrust, and that actually helps bring down the prices. How would you respond to that?
Two ways. I don't think that there's any debate that a government either suing or waving its hands around and threatening an industry can influence industry behavior. Again, that's a firm-by-firm, industry-by-industry thing. And we also have laws that already make collusion among those firms illegal. We already have that. My response to that is that that's a separate phenomenon than price increases throughout the entire economy. You have industry-by-industry prosecutorial discretion already in the hands of antitrust enforcers to go and find anti-competitive behavior and try to police it. I think in how, not that we should spend the day on meat packing or beef, although I am getting hungry, if you look at the data in those industries in particular, it tells a weird story, right? You get the White House wags its finger at the beef industry, but if you look at the prices that happen in that industry, it's sort of more consistent with you have some go up and some go down, right? So the aggregate, the average goes up. You guys have had enough law school to know that you can hide stuff in averages, right? This is what GPAs are for, right? It hides your bad grade in torts or whatever, right? That was my bad grade. But, that's what averages do. But that's really hard for Hal's story, to look at the actual data of what's going on with where the price increases are and where they aren't. So you have some price increases going up in markets where concentration's going down. What happened to firms wanting to hide the price increases that's a tough fact, right? They didn't want to increase prices on all the different types of beef, just some and not others. For a supply side monopolist who's trying to hide price increases under the cover of inflation, it's a pretty hard fact, I think, to deal with, that some of the prices are going up within the same industry and others are going down. And that, I think, the more general factual problem is that across the economy, the fundamental premise that you've got increased concentration or even concentrations that's the same just isn't true. Local concentration, Benkard et al., the Miller paper that you referenced, Rossi Hansberg, I'm naming papers with hyphens in them, sorry to the audience, are all papers that are finding more competition in local markets, not less. Makes it pretty difficult to tell a supply side sort of opportunistic monopolist story, and even harder to tell the story that all of these firms just figured out they could raise prices in the last year when markets have been concentrated, to hear Hal tell it, for a decade.
So let's turn to another point I think Hal made, which is very important. That's about collusion. So without antitrust or without any tools that the agencies can use to actually get access to companies' documents, how would it be possible for agencies or economists to tell if there's actually some tacit or explicit collusion? And that's, I take it from Hal's argument, that's a root cause for the price increases in many industries.
Yeah, I think we're going to agree over and over that collusion is bad and it results in higher prices, and that it's unlawful, right? And that it's even a felony in most cases, right? The question is whether that is responsible for price increases across the economy. It isn't. Can I make the world a better place by bringing good antitrust cases? Absolutely. Can I make the world a worse place by doing more antitrust? Absolutely. Can I do it specifically by resulting in higher prices by implementing some of the policies that this administration has proposed? Again, bringing back the Robinson-Patman Act, lots of studies showing that on net results in higher prices. The current FTC and DOJ have said they are going to do new merger guidelines and have said, you know what should be illegal? Mergers that result in marginal cost reductions that lower prices. Sort of let that marinate for a second. Mergers that result in lower prices should be illegal because they lessen competition. That's a price inflating policy, not a price deflating policy, right? The more antitrust is good, sort of look under the hood. Not all antitrust is the same. Right? So some antitrust is good, some antitrust is bad. Some antitrust results in higher prices, some antitrust results in lower prices. The sort of bumper sticker slogan that more antitrust means more competition and lower prices is if you get everything right all the time. You don't have to believe me that the administration wants to do sort of scary things that'll raise prices. You read what they put out in their press releases.
Okay, I think Hal is getting a little agitated in not responding. Hal, why don't you give us your responses to some things that Josh just said?
Yeah, let me say a few. And Josh, I would encourage you to interrupt me because I was going to go sequentially, so I shouldn't get to just go explain the 5 things you got wrong in succession. I should stop at one, and then you should apologize, or you could fix it, or whatever.
I think the list is going to be shorter.
Okay, so let's start with this one. I'm glad that you agreed you want to bring cases where there is collusion, right? And that would be wonderful if people walked around with a little sign on their forehead that said collusion, right? But you acknowledge in a paper with Judge Ginsburg that we have rampant under-enforcement, right, when it comes to cartels. And your estimate was we get about 25% of them. And so collusion is rarely detected, and it would be masked here by shortages, bottlenecks, and general chaos in the marketplace. And indeed, under these circumstances, firms would be silly not to try to exploit the situation, raise prices. Right. So my question first to you is, what is wrong with kind of turning up the heat on these particular industries, highly concentrated, increasing margins, price increases of over 10% year on year, if we have a general problem of deterrence of cartels?
I think the answer is pretty simple. Lots of things. I think most of the students in the room take at Econ 101. We keep changing the name, but I think it's called Econ Foundations or something now. Supply and demand move prices around, and what you are doing is imposing a penalty on firms that are reacting to changes in supply and demand to change prices, right? Efficient price changes have overthreaded them, and let's not forget what the antitrust laws are, what Section 1 is. Section 1 carries, on top of $100 million fines, the DOJ and FTC have argued, and Judge Ginsburg and I, shout out to our paper, thank you, debarment, not being able to serve on public companies when you are found guilty of collusion. This is a criminal statute. And so we throw around things like, what harm could it possibly do to have a criminal investigation hang over your head? Just, it's fine. If you didn't do it, don't worry. What we're doing is putting a chilling effect over the economy and the ability to flexibly change prices. What you want in a world with inflation and supply shortages, I want firms to be able to flexibly respond to changes in the economy, not worry if the DOJ is breathing down their neck or if they're going to go to jail because some regulator gets it wrong. And, I don't know if this is new to you, but sometimes the regulators get it wrong.
Okay. Second point. So, Josh, you said something about that it's the general level of prices that are going up in the CPI. But you know that the CPI is an average of a whole bunch of different sectors, and not every sector in the economy is experiencing inflation on the order of beef and poultry, which again is at 20% over the 2-year period. And if you see a chart of how that compares to almost every other segment in the economy, I mean, they're off the charts. It's like night and day. And also, these two industries are dominated, as you know, by just 4 firms. I don't have the stats exactly, but it's somewhere between 60 and 80% of the output in each of these industries are controlled by just 4 firms. So are you asking these students to believe that even though the average across the last 2 years went up by 20% across 4 firms, one of these 4 guys may have been lowering his prices over that period? Or
no, I'm saying if you
I want to suggest the opposite, that they're all going in lockstep.
If you decompose what I'm asking you is, if we want to collude, let's take your story seriously. If what I want to do is collude in the cover of inflation, nobody will catch me. First off, they'll catch you. Second off, at least 30% of the time, right? And somebody's going to jail and a firm's paying $1 billion fine. But let's take your story seriously nonetheless. If what I want to do is collude because it's a freebie during an inflationary time period, no one can catch me if all the prices are going up, then why don't these guys raise all the prices? What the point I'm making is a composition one. In that bundle that makes up the meat packing, if you sort of look at different cuts of beef or different products that they sell, some prices are going down and some prices are going up. It's almost as if supply and demand are determining the prices, Hal.
You name me the cuts that are going down when the average is going up by 20, and I'll buy you a steak dinner. Now let me ask you this thing.
Take it.
The harms from my solution, which you remember, I've got this proposal. We could defend the Robinson-Patman. We could debate that next, okay? But I'm not defending Robinson-Patman here. I'm offering a very specific proposal that when industries are highly concentrated, have year-over-year price increases of 10%, and see margin increases, right? These guys aren't just raising their prices to offset higher costs. If they were, their margins wouldn't be going up, right? So the question I have is, what are the harms of pursuing my proposal, not Robinson-Patman? We'll come to Robinson-Patman in a week, or if we want to do this again in a month, I'll defend Robinson-Patman, which is actually probably a pretty good idea in hindsight. I wish it wouldn't have gone away. But we're just here and we're talking about my proposal. And I just want to say, in terms of the efficacy, we did see the beef guys cower in response to Biden using the bully pulpit. And if you go back to Kennedy in April of 1962, he used the bully pulpit to go after the steel industry. At that point, it was amazing. It was just a 3% price increase. And he was treating them as if they were engaged in un-American activities. And the steel industry actually backed down. If you read about it, within a few days, they reversed the price increase. So if a little flexing of the antitrust muscle causes these cartels to drop their prices, I mean, that's a good thing, in my opinion. I'm waiting for you to explain to the students what's the harm.
Sure. So a couple of things. We used to both believe that an administration pushing around private industry to exert its political will was bad. You thought that was a bad thing during the Trump administration, and so did I, when they said, let's sue AT&T Time Warner to block because they don't like CNN. We both sort of stood up and we agreed for once, and it was great. Drinks were bought. We agreed. It was a lovely time. The honeymoon's over, I guess. But we thought it was bad when an administration swung its political muscle to intervene in private industry. I guess it's different for you now. It's not different for me now. It's still bad. But let me answer the harm question. Right? So here's what is harmful. This is a little bit of, these are law students, so they know how debates work, but there's a little bit of goalpost moving. Remember, the question was, I wish it was up on a big slide, but the question was, should we use antitrust as an anti-inflation tool? Or something like that. I can't see it. It's behind me. But I bet you I got close. Okay? Not, does Hal have a specific... If Hal was the chairman of the FTC, this would be a different
Lord
debate.
Help us all.
Right? we're all going to New Zealand.
But those cartels would cower. They would cut out this graph in a second. Sorry, go ahead.
But it's all right. But... if he had the power to implement this policy, well, one, it would still be a bad idea, right? But the debate question is over whether antitrust should be used as a tool to address inflation. And here you've got the administration saying, I have ideas for how to use antitrust to address inflation. The problem for Hal is that they're really bad ideas, right? That would result in higher prices. Declaring unlawful mergers that lower prices. Guess what? We'll raise prices, right? You don't even need Econ 101 for that, right? The Robinson-Patman Act, raise prices.
Here he goes again with
right? I can't wait. I can't wait for that debate.
How about my proposal, John?
Okay, let's do yours.
Okay, sorry.
You've hung criminal liability over firms in industries that you don't like for responding to supply and demand changes. That's a bad idea to hang criminal liability and hundreds of millions of dollars of civil fines over companies that are responding to supply and demand shocks in the economy. What you can do is do antitrust like we normally do. The way we catch firms in government agencies that bring suits, this is a thing that I've done, right? What we do is we go out and we investigate. We don't watch the newspapers. I got excited and raised my voice there. We don't look at the newspapers for price increases. We go out and investigate. We get complaints from firms. We use the cartel leniency program, which is where most of these prosecutions come from. Not from watching prices like a central planner in 1980s Russia and saying that one went up too much. Let's hit that button. Well, raise the price of pork. Maybe there's a price you want to go up somewhere. Maybe there's someone you want to go down somewhere. There's a form of government for that, and it doesn't have to do with competition and antitrust.
Let me jump in here. I think we have some audience questions, and I think I'm going to give Hal one because I'd like him to actually address something that Josh already touched on a little bit, and that's, are you concerned with chilling innovation at all by using antitrust as a tool to combat inflation? Why or why not?
No, I don't think that innovation is at any risk at all in what I'm proposing, and I don't think innovation is what's driving the activity of these meatpacking firms. I think that if they were responding to cost increase, as Josh suggests incorrectly, then what we would not see spiking margins, but their margins are exploding over the course of the pandemic. And I think that you have to ask yourself, are these firms, we're not declaring them enemies of the state, Josh, but they are exploiting a pandemic to see their profits go up, right? And if all they were saying was, our input costs are going up and we're just passing on these input costs to our customers, right? We wouldn't see the margins go up. But the fact that the margins go up suggests to me that they are doing something more, right? There's some extra potential joint exercise of market power here. I just want one quick analogy I want to give you. I just wrapped up a price fixing case in the capacitors industry, which is not food. It's little electronic circuits that go into your phones. And we had an executive in that case, and this got read into the record in court, so I'm not giving up anything publicly here, I'm not giving up anything that's private. And what he said was that they put out fake news stories to the press during a bout of inflation as to throw the press off from a coordinated price increase. Right? And the jury heard this. I just want you to know this does happen on the real world here on Earth, that a cartel could exploit general inflation, right, as a pretext for a coordinated price increase.
How'd that investigation get started, Hal?
I'm sure some executives got caught eventually and then turned on the rest of the cartel.
Huh.
Okay. Question for you, Josh. While we let that marinate. How do you respond to the argument that antitrust can address market concentration, and that market concentration, at least to some extent, is one of the causes of higher prices in some industries?
So this idea that there is a general link between market concentration and price has been debunked in antitrust since the 70s. Here's where Hal and I will agree. The general relationship between market concentration and price just simply doesn't exist. It's not in the literature. It's not what the evidence is. In the papers that Hal cites, and he already talked about, the evidence is falling market concentration at the local level, not increasing. And the evidence is that most 63% of the markup in the same Miller paper that you brought up, 63% of the increase in markups is because marginal costs are falling. And this is across I know you just want to talk about meat, but this is about 330 product markets, not just meat, right? Lots of products in grocery stores that people buy. Some of us buy stuff other than meat. Okay? But the increase in markups isn't because input prices are going up. Marginal cost is falling. You're getting an intensification of competition across the economy, and that's not the story the news wants to tell, and it's not the story. It's a far less sexy story than big tech bad do antitrust, but if that takes most of the air out of the room.
If costs were falling, they would drop their prices, right? In the competitive industry, they wouldn't raise their prices.
Supply and demand at the same time. Lots of stuff can happen at the same time.
Right,
you know that better than I.
Let's go to the next question. But this isn't about a correlation between. My story is not a correlation of concentration and prices. It's that higher concentration, all things equal, makes it more susceptible. You've heard of the concept of coordinated effects in merger review. These industries are more susceptible at the margin relative to unconcentrated industries, right, for engaging in coordinated practices.
Right, and so that begs the question. For the markets, there are plenty of concentrated markets. I'm talking about sort of trends across the economy because inflation is an economy-wide phenomenon. But we would both agree there are markets that are concentrated, there are markets that aren't concentrated. The problem that you have is the story is you've got to have this really, really particular story that in the concentrated markets, what has to happen just right is that in these concentrated markets, it's got to be that firms that never understood how to collude before decided inflation is the perfect cover because we're not going to get caught because other prices are going to go up. I think that's just based on this false model of how these guys get caught. They don't get caught because someone sees the prices and tells the DOJ, oh my goodness, prices went up. They get caught like they did in the case that you just talked about because someone who's a member of the cartel snitches. Or because some customer identifies it, or because there's a dumb CEO who admits to it somewhere, right? That's how they get caught. They get caught because the Sherman Act is a wiretapping statute, right? They don't get caught because, somebody reads in the newspaper, prices went up 7%, let's start an industry investigation. That's stuff for central planners, not for antitrust agencies.
Okay. I have one more question for both of you. So according to Hal's argument, inflation provided the cover for market collusion and warrants antitrust enforcement, right? But many of the issues today, like COVID-19, large amounts of stimulus spending, and supply chain disruptions, will hopefully help with those problems to subside. But what about the consequences of the hypothetical antitrust policies and precedent? Are they worth living with?
That's for you.
Sure. I think this goes to the harms, and I'm still not convinced that there are any. The question is, let's suppose that the agencies were to adopt my three-part trigger, and you investigated pork or you investigated meat, and there was no there, and then the dogs get called off. And maybe the executives, in the interim didn't, decided to cut their prices. Maybe they were kind of bullish and they kept raising prices throughout the investigation. The investigation goes away and we're done. So it's hard for me to conceive of what the lasting harm is under the policy that I'm prescribing.
Well, I have one more question from the audience. Seems like everyone is really interested in debating Hal here. The question is Hal basically suggesting that supply and demand market economic theory is incorrect? Seems like his point is that firms do not react to demand and supply side factors and are more interested in risking collusion.
No, the laws of supply and demand don't go out the window. And these economists that I mentioned to you, Fiona Scott Morton, Steve Salop, Nathan Miller, these are serious industrial organization economists, and they've putting forward theories that explain why concentrated industries are going to generate bigger price effects in times of disruptions. Okay, and so we don't need to abandon Econ 101, but this is slightly more sophisticated than 101. And the idea here is that we have limited tools to go after inflation. If the problem is going on the supply side, one of the supply tools that we have is to make these industries more competitive. And as Nathan Miller puts it, that is flattening the supply curve. What that means is that in response to future demand shocks, we won't see the price spikes that we see today, right? So this theory that I'm proposing here is, I think, very well and solidly grounded in modern IO.
That's a perfect timing. Now I'm going to give Hal 2 more minutes for your closing argument. Whenever you're ready.
All right. Just 3 simple themes that I want to drive home here. First, using inflation as one of many tools to go after, using antitrust as one of the tools to go after inflation survives a cost-benefit test, right? So on the benefit side, what we could do is deter future price increases. Maybe just the mere threat of the investigation would cause these cartels to rethink their price hikes. And on the cost side, I have not heard yet Josh articulate a real harm from moving forward with the proposal that I'm offering. So I think on a cost-benefit test, my proposal survives. Second, we've already seen some success from this policy already. I talked about Biden using the bully pulpit in December of last year, and we saw a reversal on beef prices. Kennedy did it as well in 62. And so I feel like Josh has not offered a reason yet for why beef prices, after going up and up and up for 2 years, suddenly reversed right at the time that that Biden gave a speech. Now, maybe it's because Josh has cut his meat consumption in December. Maybe he had fewer steaks, but I don't think so. And I certainly didn't drop my steak consumption either in December. And my third thing I want to say is the use of inflation to flatten the supply curve has good foundations in economics. I've mentioned these antitrust luminaries before. So I think I'm just going to leave it at that.
That's great. Josh, whenever you are ready.
I won't need all 2. So good antitrust cases should be brought. That is a separate question from whether antitrust is a useful tool to address inflation throughout the economy. The theoretical link between antitrust and inflation requires facts and evidence that are simply not true. It requires firms either to not firms in concentrated markets to not understand somehow that they can raise prices under the cover of inflation, or it requires price increases in markets that are getting more competitive over time. The harms are relatively simple. There are a whole host of proposals to do more antitrust that explicitly, intentionally, deliberately will result in higher prices, not lower prices. Hal don't like those plans. At least not now. He's got his own. When his own is, let's open a criminal investigation if you are in a concentrated industry and you change your prices around. It doesn't take much to think about the cost. Think about a criminal investigation hanging over the head of a firm who results to supplier demand shifts, right? This is not harmful to think about, not difficult to think about what the harms to the economy are from hanging criminal liability over an enterprise for moving its price around. That we should cheer a White House, whether the Trump administration or the Biden administration, or what did we do, Kennedy? Right? Whether we should cheer an administration for waving a stick around to threaten private industry and be shocked that it gets away, that it gets its way, and pretend that that has something to do with the merits of supply and demand moving around prices, I think doesn't need much of a response. I tend to view government threats of private industry without bringing a case as a bug and not a feature of government supervision of the economy. I'll use the word pretext a lot. I think that is apt. It is not pretext of inflation as pretext for collusion. Rather, it is using inflation and the inflation debate as pretext to bring some more cases. And I wish my friend would just say that he's got a preference to bring a whole boatload of antitrust cases. Then we could leave and get a drink and move on.
Well,
Thank you.
I think that was a great way to end. We are opening up our post-debate polls. If you all would like to go in and vote, see which one of our esteemed speakers here has persuaded you. Okay, I think it is safe to still moving.
Okay.
Coming back.
Remember, the pre-debate poll was 52.2 versus 47.8. That's yes and no.
Yeah, and it looks like Josh here has convinced the majority of the people in the audience that antitrust should not be used as an anti-inflation tool at 59.1%.
Well, until next time, here on Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.